Exactly 60 days. That's all the time left. Then the gates of the United States will slam shut forever, for over half the African continent. This isn't about terrorism. It's not a UN resolution. It's the calculated cold-blooded decision of one man, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. On June 4, 2025, Trump signed an executive order banning citizens from 12 countries, 7 of them African. But that was just the opening shot. 10 days later, a leaked cable signed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio sent shockwaves across the continent. 25 more African nations were on the chopping block. The final number, 32 African countries, more than half the continent targeted for exclusion. No debate, no consultation. Just a chilling ultimatum: you have 60 days to comply. Fail and face full entry bans, visa cancellations, halted flights, diplomatic freezes, and economic isolation. This isn't foreign policy, it's a diplomatic death sentence. From Addis Ababa to Lagos, from Accra to Khartoum, governments panicked. Ministers collapsed into closed-door meetings. Ambassadors flew frantically to Washington. Emergency action plans were scribbled in the dark, the mood like a war countdown. This is an invasion without tanks. Just denied visas and suspended aid. And African leaders now face a brutal choice: kneel and beg Trump for mercy, or rise and risk economic devastation. As the continent trembles, one man stands tall. In Ouagadougou, capital of a landlocked, resource-strapped nation, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, once dismissed by Western media as a military radical, looked straight at Washington and declared, "Cut your aid, we'll mine our gold. Ban our visas, we'll build our hospitals. If you turn your backs, Africa will turn its face." While Nigeria pleads, Ghana scrambles. Ethiopia negotiates, Burkina Faso is building. With gold, with grit, with pride. This is not just about immigration. This is a clash of worlds: the old Africa dependent, pleading, patronized, and the new Africa sovereign, strategic and rising. In a twist of fate, Trump has become the unintentional architect of an African reckoning. He has forced the continent to choose, and the clock is ticking. 59 days remain. Will Africa beg, or will it rise? The countdown had barely begun, and then came the second blow. 10 days after the first travel ban, a leaked U.S. State Department cable struck like a thunderclap. Signed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, it revealed plans to expand Trump's order to 36 more nations, 25 of them African. In total, over half the continent blacklisted. The message was clear: fix your immigration systems, comply with U.S. standards, cooperate on deportations. You have 60 days or be cut off from America completely. No diplomacy, no debate, just a clock ticking down. Panic exploded across African capitals. In Nigeria, ministers scrambled to preserve their U.S. access, terrified their children studying at Yale and Columbia might be sent home. In Ghana, emergency teams worked overnight drafting cooperation pledges to win Washington's mercy. In Ethiopia, outrage brewed: "We fought America's wars. Now we're punished like enemies." The bans weren't aimed at threats, they were aimed at control. Trump didn't send tanks, he sent fear, and fear worked. Across the continent, presidents bent systems buckled and foreign policy realigned under pressure. But not everywhere. In one corner of Africa, a different reaction was brewing. President Mohamed Idris Deby banned American citizens from entering his country. "Chad is sovereign," he declared. "We will not bow to insults." It was more than defiance, it was a crack in the wall of submission. And soon, others began to ask if Chad can resist. Why can't we? While Trump's travel ban stirred panic, his second strike went deeper, straight to the lungs of Africa's governments. In early 2025, even before the visa crackdown, Trump signed a sweeping order, slashing USAID funding across the continent. Billions in development aid gone, no transition, no grace period, just one message: Africa, you're on your own. The result? Chaos. In Ghana, hospitals ran out of supplies. In Nigeria, anti-corruption units closed their doors overnight. In Ethiopia, school meal programs vanished. But the real damage wasn't logistical, it was political. For years, foreign aid had been the silent engine of African leadership. USAID funded not just projects, but politicians' power, prestige, and public image. Without it, the illusion shattered. "We never thought the tap would run dry," confessed one Ghanaian minister. "Now we see we never controlled the faucet." The mask was off. African leaders, once seen as capable statesmen, were exposed as caretakers of donor dependency. Their citizens, long distracted by handouts and headlines, now asked, "Why did we need outsiders to build our hospitals, feed our children, fund our schools?" And they had no answer. In every capital, panic turned into paralysis. Some looked to China, others to the Gulf. But deep down, they knew no aid could replace legitimacy. Trump hadn't just withdrawn support, he had yanked the crutch from beneath decades of political theater. And while most governments staggered, one stood tall: Burkina Faso, a country with no oil, no sea, no mercy from the West. But one thing, it had a captain who refused to beg. While others stumbled in the dark, Burkina Faso lit a torch. No pleas to Washington, no backdoor deals, no hired lobbyists in D.C., instead they built. At the center stood a 36-year-old soldier, once dismissed as just another coup leader. Now, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was quietly crafting a revolution rooted in gold pride and brutal honesty. His first move turned Burkina Faso's natural wealth inward. Instead of exporting gold to foreign markets, Traoré redirected the revenue to fund public hospitals, schools, and roads. In 2024 alone, medical fees were slashed by 70%. MRI machines arrived. Rural clinics reopened. And in the village of Kudugu, a girl named Amina watched her dying mother recover without debt, without waiting for foreign aid. "I want to be a doctor," she said, "like the ones who saved Mama." That wasn't charity, it was policy. Then came agriculture. Traoré banned the export of raw crops. Instead, he launched a wave of local processing centers, creating jobs and keeping value inside the country. Farmers like Mariam Sayogo, once at the mercy of foreign demand, now sold millet and sorghum at domestic markets. "We prayed for rain," she recalled. "Now we have tools, seeds, and pride. And infrastructure, no IMF loans, no Chinese debt traps, just Burkinabe hands building Burkinabe roads." In the Sahel, remote towns, once unreachable, were connected to cities. Trade surged. Access to healthcare soared. Schools reopened. Dreams returned. And all without a single dollar from Trump. While other leaders bent under U.S. pressure, Traoré stood unshaken. He didn't just survive the aid cuts, he made them irrelevant. While others clung to foreign food imports and international aid, Burkina Faso declared war on hunger and dependency from the ground up. Captain Traoré understood a basic truth most leaders ignored: he who controls food controls fate. For decades, Burkina Faso had exported raw agricultural products, cotton, shea nuts, millet, while importing processed food at higher prices. The result: farmers stayed poor. Jobs were shipped overseas. Dependency deepened. In 2024, Traoré flipped the script. He banned the export of unprocessed agricultural goods, demanding that all produce be refined, packaged, and sold locally. It was a bold move, risky even, but it paid off. Dozens of small-scale factories sprang up. Shea butter processing plants, millet packaging hubs, cotton spinning centers. Young Burkinabe, once fleeing to Europe, returned to find work, purpose, and stability. The countryside came alive. In the northern region of Yatenga, a mother of 6 named Mariam Sayogo used to struggle to feed her children with her tiny harvests. Now, supported by government-issued irrigation systems and farming tools, she grows enough sorghum to supply 2 towns. "We used to wait for rain," she said. "Now we control our harvest. We feed ourselves. We even sell." The government didn't just provide tools, it built co-ops, trained farmers, and created guaranteed market access. It wasn't a handout. It was a national investment. Food insecurity plummeted, rural income surged, and for the first time in a generation, Burkina Faso farmers weren't just surviving, they were thriving. In a continent still chained by food imports, Burkina Faso's agricultural revolution sent a message louder than any speech: Africa can feed itself. And no policy from Washington, no visa ban, no aid cut could stop that harvest. As Western-backed nations scrambled to save suspended aid projects, Burkina Faso was laying concrete and foundations for the future. Captain Traoré didn't wait for World Bank loans or IMF handouts. Instead, he channeled the country's gold, phosphate, and manganese revenues into roads, bridges, and schools. The philosophy was clear: if it's Burkina Faso soil, it should serve Burkina Faso people. Gone were the days of imported contractors and overpriced consultants. The government bought its own equipment: bulldozers, asphalt mixers, graders, and employed local engineers and workers. And they got to work. In the Sahel, once ignored and inaccessible, new paved roads sliced through dust and isolation. Villages like Djibo and Garam, previously cut off by crumbling paths, were now linked to markets and hospitals. "We thought roads were for the capital," said Isaugo, a farmer from Djibo. "Now we drive our goods to town in hours, not days." But Traoré's vision didn't stop at roads. It reached the classroom. Hundreds of new schools rose from the red earth, especially in rural zones, where education had been a luxury. Uniforms and textbooks were provided free. Teacher salaries were funded from mining revenues, not donor spreadsheets. And in 2024, 2 new medical universities opened, training doctors, nurses, and specialists, in-country cutting reliance on foreign staff and NGOs. This wasn't just infrastructure, it was independence cemented in stone and steel. Each road built was a route away from dependence. Each school opened was a weapon against ignorance. Each graduate trained was a stake in a future not owned by Washington or Paris, but by Ouagadougou. While the world debated sanctions and aid cuts, Burkina Faso built, quietly, steadily, proudly. Trump didn't mean to inspire Africa, but he did. His bans, his cuts, his ultimatums, they were designed to pressure, to isolate, to control, but instead they exposed, they provoked, they awakened. Across the continent, leaders scrambled, desperate to preserve comfort, privilege, access. But in the dust of crisis, Burkina Faso emerged not as a victim, but as a vision. While others begged, it built. While others panicked, it planned. While others submitted, it stood. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this small, landlocked nation defied gravity. It showed that a country can thrive without Western aid, without visas, without permission. It offered a blueprint not just for Burkina Faso, but for a self-reliant, united Africa, one that processes its own crops, trains its own doctors, builds its own roads, speaks in its own voice. Traoré didn't just challenge the West. He challenged Africa itself to rise, to remember, to lead. Because the truth is no longer hidden. Africa is not poor, it is plundered. Africa is not weak, it is divided. Africa is not dependent, it is misled. Now a choice stands before every African leader. Will you continue begging for handouts while your gold funds foreign banks? Or will you, like Burkina Faso, claim what is already yours? Trump may have slammed the door shut, but maybe that's exactly what Africa needed to stop knocking and start building. When the bond became a wake-up call, Burkina Faso and the fire of African sovereignty. Some policies are designed to control, some executive orders are signed to intimidate, and some decisions expected to bring a continent to its knees instead ignite a revolution of spirit. That's exactly what unfolded when Donald Trump returned to the White House and unleashed a wave of restrictions aimed squarely at Africa. But the most astonishing part wasn't the ban itself, it was the response. One nation refused to kneel. And through that defiance, a message echoed louder than any presidential proclamation: Africa is not weak. It is waking up. Trump's return was marked by familiar themes: national security, immigration control, America first. But for Africa, this meant something else entirely. A travel ban expanded to include over 30 countries. A 60-day ultimatum. A slashed USAID budget with no negotiation. The tools of pressure were surgical. They targeted the elite, those who sent children to Harvard, who shopped in New York, who dined in Geneva, while their people struggled at home. Suddenly that comfort was gone. The fear was real. African ministers scrambled. Diplomats begged. Presidents panicked. And yet somewhere between the headlines and hysteria, the illusion cracked. The West had always styled itself as a savior, but Trump pulled the curtain. He made it clear Africa was never a partner in the Western model, it was a dependent. And now that dependence was being weaponized. It wasn't just a ban, it was a mirror, and it forced Africa to look at itself. Then came the pivot, the shift, the spark. While others pleaded, Burkina Faso stood still, anchored by something rare in modern politics: dignity. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a young military leader once mocked by foreign media, suddenly embodied what many had forgotten: sovereignty. He didn't tweet threats. He didn't send envoys. He didn't hire lobbyists. He built. Hospitals stocked with machines, bought not by donors, but with the nation's gold. Schools constructed without waiting for Western grants. Roads paved by Burkina hands. Farmers cultivating not to export raw crops to France, but to process them into value at home. And when the world asked how, Traoré answered simply, "We begged for 60 years. What did it bring us now? We build with what we have." Burkina Faso became a map, a living blueprint for what Africa could be without handouts. But more importantly, it became a mirror, one that exposed the fault lines in countries still stuck in the old model. Countries with oil, but no electricity. Countries with mines, but no medicine. Governments bloated with donor reports, but bankrupt in responsibility. Traoré's defiance wasn't just political, it was cultural. He rejected victimhood. He rejected dependency. He rejected the idea that Africa had to ask for permission to live. And for once, Africa listened. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Lagos to Nairobi, intellectuals, youth activists began to ask, why are we still begging for food when we feed the world? Why do we export gold, then borrow money with interest? Why do we need aid to build clinics on land full of cobalt and lithium? Questions once whispered in dorm rooms were now shouted in parliaments. Traoré didn't give the answers. He gave them the courage to ask. Here lies the great irony. Trump, a man who sought to isolate Africa, may have inadvertently united it. His bans exposed the true nature of power imbalance. His aid cuts revealed the rot beneath many governments. His arrogance gave rise to Africa's assertiveness. What was meant to silence inspired. What was intended to dominate challenged. What was built to suppress now fuels a movement. Not anti-American, but pro-African. Trump will go. Another president will come. But something has changed. The days of quiet compliance are over. Now Africa faces a question more powerful than any sanction. Will we continue to seek legitimacy from outside or build it from within? Will leaders continue flying to Washington for validation or start looking to Ouagadougou for inspiration? Will we be content with scraps of aid, or will we learn to bake our own bread? Because Burkina Faso has proven something radical, that with dignity, discipline, and vision, a nation can walk without a crutch. Not perfectly, not easily, but fully and proudly. And in this story, there is pain, yes, but also possibility, the possibility of an Africa that processes its cocoa, that refines its oil, that trains its own surgeons, that negotiates from power, not pity, the possibility of an Africa that doesn't just resist the world, but helps reshape it. History doesn't change when empires speak. It changes when nations decide to listen to themselves again. Trump's ban may have closed a door, but it forced Africa to ask, what if we never needed that door? And somewhere in the red dust of Burkina Faso, a new door opened. It leads not to America nor Europe, but forward, together. With our heads high, what began as a moment of isolation became a defining test, a crucible in which the character of African leadership was exposed. Some folded under pressure. Others waited for someone else to take the lead. But a few, just a few, chose to confront the fire. And in that confrontation, a new vocabulary began to emerge. No longer the language of dependency, of donor reports, budget shortfalls, and capacity building, but the language of sovereignty, of we have enough, of we are enough, of we build because we must. Burkina Faso was never meant to lead this movement. It has no coastline, no sprawling metropolis, no stock exchange, but it had something that history respects: courage, and courage once seen is contagious. In Senegal, students at the Université Cheikh Anta Diop began organizing forums on resource nationalism. In Kenya, farmers demanded state funding for local processing instead of subsidies for export cartels. In Congo, a single viral video showed a teenager asking her president, "Why are our minerals everywhere, but our hospitals have no power?" A continent was stirring. Traoré's Burkina Faso was no longer an exception. It was becoming an example. It wasn't just presidents who paid attention, it was the people. For decades, African civil society had been caught in a web of NGOs, most headquartered abroad, with strategies scripted from Geneva, Stockholm, or DC. But now, grassroots voices were rising, not to oppose foreign help, but to redefine what help means. In Togo, a women-led farming cooperative stopped accepting European microloans and instead pooled their harvest income to fund irrigation systems. In Tanzania, young coders launched apps to track government spending on infrastructure, making corruption harder to hide and accountability harder to escape. In Malawi, teachers began redesigning curriculum around African authors, African leaders, African ideas, finally replacing the colonial syllabus that praised conquerors and ignored creators. These weren't revolutions in the streets, they were revolutions in the soul. Perhaps the most profound shift wasn't economic, but psychological. For years, African youth were told to think globally, which often meant look west. But after 2025, a new call echoed: think continentally. Think Sankara, think Nkrumah, think Cabral, think Africa as the center, not the shadow. Traoré's speeches, sober, unpolished, uncompromising, were shared not for their charisma, but for their clarity. He didn't promise miracles, he promised work. He didn't paint illusions, he planted questions, and those questions cut deep. Who decides our future? Why do we beg from the same hands that once shackled us? What if everything we need is already beneath our feet and within our people? For the first time in a generation, Africa wasn't just defending itself from outside narratives, it was writing its own. No one is naive. Burkina Faso's path is difficult. Gold revenues fluctuate. Terrorist threats remain. Internal divisions persist. But the difference now is direction. And direction matters more than perfection. When Traoré stood before his people and said, "We will not trade dignity for comfort," he offered more than policy. He offered a compass. And others began to follow. In Mali, President Assimi Goïta canceled over a dozen exploitative mining contracts and launched an audit of foreign land leases. In Niger, the government began re-evaluating military deals with Western nations, asking a long-avoided question: security for whom? In Guinea, youth marches demanded transparency in bauxite contracts and accountability for environmental destruction. Each step small, each step imperfect, but each step real. The world noticed, at first with condescension, then with confusion, now with caution. Investors began calling Africa unpredictable. Think tanks wrote papers titled "The Rise of Afro-Nationalism." Diplomats whispered of a shift we can no longer ignore. But this wasn't nationalism, it was self-definition. And it wasn't anti-Western, it was post-Western. It was the idea that Africa doesn't need to choose between Washington and Beijing, but can choose itself. Between the IMF and silence, there is agency. Between isolation and obedience, there is integrity. And perhaps the West's greatest mistake wasn't the ban or the aid cuts, but the assumption that Africa would collapse without them. Instead, it adapted. And in doing so, it discovered something long buried beneath the rubble of dependency power. Burkina Faso didn't erupt, it endured. Its story isn't one of dramatic revolutions or overnight miracles. It's the story of quiet hands working soil, laying bricks, writing laws, healing wounds with no spotlight. And that is its greatest strength, because fireworks fade, but flames, if protected, become hearths. They warm villages, they feed families, they light paths, and one day when enough are lit across a dark continent, they burn away the night. Traore didn't promise to light the whole fire, he simply struck the match. For centuries, Africa's story had been written in the language of dependence on colonizers, on creditors, on outside approval. Maps were redrawn by foreign hands. Leaders were chosen in distant capitals. Even hope was imported shrink-wrapped in aid programs with expiration dates. But 2025 marked a crack in that old script. It wasn't a revolution of guns, it was a revolution of gaze. For the first time, African leaders, some reluctantly, others resolutely began to look inward, not outward. They stopped asking how to fit into the world, and started asking how to reshape their world. And at the center of this realignment stood a landlocked country with no sea, no skyscrapers, and no Western approval, but with an unshakable belief that dignity is not a luxury. It is a birthright. Burkina Faso wasn't trying to lead the continent. It was simply trying to lead itself. But in doing so, it showed the rest of Africa what happens when a nation refuses to be afraid. Captain Traoré's approach was as radical as it was simple: remove fear from governance. Fear of donors, fear of embargoes, fear of being cut off. In place of fear, he injected truth. He stood before the youth of his country and declared, "We will no longer send our minerals to enrich Paris while our mothers give birth on clinic floors. If they call that radical, so be it." He made no apologies for self-interest. He made no apologies for Africa, and something remarkable happened. People listened, not just Burkinabe, but Africans across the continent, not because Traoré was eloquent, but because he was unapologetically honest. He wasn't polished, he was precise. He wasn't soft, he was sincere. And in a world of performative politics, sincerity hit like thunder. It started in small corners. A professor in Dakar added a module on post-aid economies to his curriculum. A blogger in Uganda wrote an op-ed titled, "What If We Stopped Begging It Went Viral." A rapper in Kinshasa dropped a track called Burkina Blood, a gritty anthem about pride and sacrifice. Bit by bit, the language of power shifted. Words like debt forgiveness were replaced with resource justice. Technical assistance gave way to sovereign innovation. The continent wasn't just reacting to crisis, it was reimagining its voice. And the voice was getting louder, but inspiration alone is not enough. Traoré knew this. That's why every speech ended with a call to build, to sow, to mine, to teach, to repair. Freedom isn't won in hashtags or headlines, it's won in harvests and homework. So Burkina Faso got to work. Local mining operations implemented new transparency laws, allowing citizens to see in real time how gold revenues were spent. Public procurement was digitized, cutting corruption in half within a year. In rural communities, decentralized solar grids were installed, funded not by the World Bank, but by gold taxes. And in a symbolic act that shook the continent, Traoré opened his cabinet meetings to live radio, letting every farmer, taxi driver, and school teacher hear how decisions were made. Transparency wasn't just policy, it was armor. Because when people see the process, they protect the progress. Other leaders watch, some in admiration, others in fear. What if our people expect the same one East African official whispered in a leaked memo? But the truth was already out. Burkina Faso had taken a different road. It was rough, it was lonely, it was filled with obstacles, but it led forward. And that more than anything terrified the status quo, because if one country could walk that road and survive, then others might follow. If one nation could reject aid and still build roads, hospitals and schools, then the myth of helpless Africa would collapse, and with it the power of those who profited from that myth. For decades, African leaders hid behind a convenient lie. We would fix things, if only we had support. Now that lie was melting under the sun of proof. Traore had stripped away the alibis. He showed that with discipline a government could cut corruption, that with courage a country could say no to unfair contracts, that with focus a people could feed themselves. There were no more excuses, only choices. This isn't the end of the story. Burkina Faso still faces threats both internal and external. Traore still walks a tightrope between hope and hardship. But what's clear is this: the continent has crossed a threshold. The old tools of control, sanctions, travel, bans, donor summits no longer carry the weight they once did, because now Africa has a reference point, a nation that said, "We will not kneel," and then stood up. When history is written, the footnotes often carry more truth than the headlines. And in one of those footnotes, maybe decades from now, someone will find a single sentence: "When the world closed its doors, Burkina Faso opened its eyes." That sentence won't tell the whole story, but it will remind future generations that in 2025, at a time of pressure and panic, a small nation refused to disappear. It refused to stay silent. And in doing so, it spoke for millions. The story of Burkina Faso is not perfect. It is not easy. It is not without danger, but it is honest. And in a world addicted to illusion, honesty is the greatest rebellion. The road ahead remains steep. External forces will not surrender easily. Multinational companies will find new contracts. Old powers will fund new proxies. Sanctions may come dressed in new names. Even within Africa, not all hands are clean, and not all hearts are free. But something irreversible has happened. A fire has been lit. Not a fire that consumes, but one that clarifies. A fire that reveals the bones of an old system and the shape of something new. What began with a ban ended in a blueprint. A vision not for a perfect Africa, but for a possible Africa. One that remembers its worth. One that feeds its children without permission. One that sends engineers to its mines and doctors to its villages, not to Europe. One that understands, if your wealth is underground but your children go hungry, the problem is not the soil, it is the system. And systems can be changed. Donald Trump may have thought he was slamming a door on Africa, but in truth, he did Africa a favor. He forced it to stop knocking. For too long, African leaders waited on conference invitations, on trade pacts, on investment forums where decisions were made about Africa, never with Africa. But now Ouagadougou has replaced Geneva in the imagination of the youth. Now young people speak not of exile, but of return. Now the currency of pride is rising faster than any stock market. That door, the one that always led outside, had to close. Because Africa's next chapter will not be written in New York or Brussels. It will be written in Bobo Dioulasso, in Bamako, in Niamey, in places once considered too poor, too unstable, too forgotten. The world may still ignore these places, but Africa won't. There is a quiet kind of power that comes not from shouting but from building, and in the silence of ignored nations that power is now growing. Burkina Faso has not declared war. It has not burned embassies. It has not asked for pity. It has built clinics. It has paved roads. It has planted seeds. It has taught its children that a flag is not just a symbol, but a statement. We are not finished, because Africa is not finished. It is unfinished, unwritten, underrated, and now unapologetic. The age of begging is ending, the age of bargaining is beginning, and the bargaining chip is no longer just minerals, it is mindset. Ibrahim Traoré may not remain in power forever. He may fall to the same pressures that brought down others before him: assassination, division, isolation. These threats are real, but the seed he has planted lives beyond any term limit. He has reintroduced an ancient truth to a modern generation: that sovereignty is not a gift, it is a discipline, and when practiced patiently, relentlessly, collectively, it becomes unshakable. Even if Traoré were gone tomorrow, the question he posed would linger like a storm cloud above every presidential palace on the continent. If Burkina Faso can rise without begging, why can't you? That is not a question one can ignore. That is a mirror one cannot unsee. The West is watching, some with alarm, some with admiration, but all with attention, because something is happening that was never supposed to happen. A continent is waking up without permission. A people are learning to say no, not in anger, but in certainty. And when enough people say no to theft, and yes to themselves, history does not just bend, it breaks, and something new is born. So let the world scoff, let them predict failure, let them mock a small country that dares to dream, because they laughed at Sankara, they laughed at Nkrumah, they laughed at Mandela, and still Africa rises. This story is not a conclusion, it is an invitation. To every student reading this, ask more. To every leader watching, build better. To every outsider observing, listen deeper. Because the question is no longer whether Africa can survive without the West. The question is, can the world survive a sovereign Africa? And the answer is being written now. One clinic, one factory, one farmer, one fearless voice at a time. Burkina Faso has made its choice. Now the continent must decide, will we remain in the waiting room of history, or will we walk into the storm together, heads high, finally writing our own name on the future? The pen is in our hands.